Book 1, Chapter 1 of On the Education of an Orator, by Quintilian, translated by H. E. Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I would, therefore, have a father conceive the highest hopes of his son from the moment of his birth. If he does so, he will be more careful about the groundwork of his education, for there is absolutely no foundation for the complaint that but few men have the power to take in the knowledge that is imparted to them, and that the majority are so slow of understanding that education is a waste of time and labor. On the contrary, you will find that most are quick to reason and ready to learn. Reasoning comes as naturally to men as flying to birds, speed to horses, and ferocity to beasts of prey. Our minds are endowed by nature with such activity and sagacity that the soul is believed to proceed from heaven. Those who are dull and unteachable are as abnormal as prodigious births and monstrosities, and are but few in number. A proof of what I say is to be found in the fact that boys commonly show promise of many accomplishments, and when such promise dies away as they grow up, this is plainly due not to the failure of natural gifts, but to lack of the requisite care. But, it will be urged, there are degrees of talent. Undoubtedly, I reply, and there will be a corresponding variation in actual accomplishment. But that there are any who gain nothing from education, I absolutely deny. The man who shares this conviction must, as soon as he becomes a father, devote the utmost care to fostering the promise shown by the son whom he destines to become an orator. Above all, see that the child's nurse speaks correctly. The ideal, according to Chrysippus, would be that she should be a philosopher. Failing that, he desired that the best should be chosen as far as possible. No doubt the most important point is that they should be of good character, but they should speak correctly as well. It is the nurse that the child first hears, and her words that he will first attempt to imitate. And we are by nature most tenacious of childish impressions, just as the flavor first absorbed by vessels when new persists, and the color imparted by dyes to the primitive whiteness of wool is indelible. Further, it is the worst impressions that are most durable. For, while what is good readily deteriorates, it will never turn vice into virtue. Do not, therefore, allow the boy to become accustomed, even in infancy, to a style of speech which he will subsequently have to unlearn. As regards parents, I should like to see them as highly educated as possible, and I do not restrict this remark to fathers alone. We are told that the eloquence of the Gracchi owed much to their mother Cornelia, whose letters even to-day testify to the cultivation of her style. Lelia, the daughter of Gaius Laelius, is said to have reproduced the elegance of her father's language in her own speech, while the oration delivered before the triumvirs by Hortensia, the daughter of Quintus Hortensius, is still read, and not merely as a compliment to her sex. And even those who have not had the fortune to receive a good education should not, for that reason, devote less care to their sons' education, but should, on the contrary, show all the greater diligence in other matters where they can be of service to their children. As regards the boys in whose company our budding orator is to be brought up, I would repeat what I have said about nurses. As regards his pedagogi, I would urge that they should have had a thorough education, or if they have not, that they should be aware of the fact. There are none worse than those who, as soon as they have progressed beyond a knowledge of the alphabet, delude themselves into the belief that they are the possessors of real knowledge. for they disdain to stoop to the drudgery of teaching, and conceiving that they have acquired a certain title to authority, a frequent source of vanity in such persons, become imperious or even brutal in instilling a thorough dose of their own folly. Their misconduct is no less prejudicial to morals. We are, for instance, told by Diogenes of Babylon that Leonidas, Alexander's pedagogus, infected his pupil with certain faults, which, as a result of his education as a boy, clung to him even in his maturer years, when he had become the greatest of kings. If any of my readers regards me as somewhat exacting in my demands, I would ask him to reflect that it is no easy task to create an orator, even though his education be carried out under the most favorable circumstances, and that further and greater difficulties are still before us. For continuous application, the very best of teachers and a variety of exercises are necessary. Therefore, the rules which we lay down for the education of our pupil must be of the best. If any one refuses to be guided by them, the fault will lie not with the method, but with the individual. Still, if it should prove impossible to secure the ideal nurse, the ideal companions, or the ideal pedagogus, I would insist that there should be one person at any rate attached to the boy who has some knowledge of speaking, and who will, if any incorrect expression should be used by nurse or pedagogus in the presence of the child under their charge, at once correct the error and prevent its becoming a habit. But it must be clearly understood that this is only a remedy, and that the ideal course is that indicated above. I prefer that a boy should begin with Greek, because Latin, being in general use, will be picked up by him whether we will or no, while the fact that Latin learning is derived from Greek is a further reason for his being first introduced in the latter. I do not, however, desire that this principle should be so superstitiously observed that he should for long speak and learn only Greek, as is done in the majority of cases. Such a course gives rise to many faults of language and accent. The latter tends to acquire a foreign intonation, while the former, through force of habit, becomes impregnated with Greek idioms, which persist with extreme obstinacy even when we are speaking another tongue. The study of Latin ought, therefore, to follow at no great distance, and in a short time proceed side by side with Greek. The result will be that, as soon as we begin to give equal attention to both languages, neither will prove a hindrance to the other. Some hold that boys should not be taught to read till they are 7 years old, that being the earliest age at which they can derive profit from instruction and endure the strain of learning. Most of them attribute this view to Hesiod, at least such as lived before the time of Aristophanes the grammarian, who was the first to deny that the Hypotheke, in which this opinion is expressed, was the work of that poet. But other authorities, among them Eratosthenes, give the same advice. Those, however, who hold that a child's mind should not be allowed to lie fallow for a moment, are wiser. Chrysippus, for instance, though he gives the nurses a 3 years' reign, still holds the formation of the child's mind on the best principles to be a part of their duties. Why, again, since children are capable of moral training, should they not be capable of literary education? I am well aware that during the whole period of which I am speaking, we can expect scarcely the same amount of progress that 1 year will effect afterwards. Still, those who disagree with me seem in taking the line to spare the teacher rather than the pupil. What better occupation can a child have so soon as he is able to speak? and he must be kept occupied somehow or other. Or why should we despise the profit to be derived before the age of 7, small though it be? For though the knowledge absorbed in the previous years may be but little, yet the boy will be learning something more advanced during that year in which he would otherwise have been occupied with something more elementary. Such progress each successive year is clear profit to the period of youth. Further, as regards the years which follow, I must emphasize the importance of learning what has to be learnt in good time. Let us not therefore waste the earliest years. There's all the less excuse for this, since the elements of literary training are solely a question of memory, which not only exists even in small children, but is specially retentive at that age. I am not, however, so blind to differences of age as to think that the very young should be forced on prematurely or given real work to do. Above all things, we must take care that the child, who is not yet old enough to love his studies, does not come to hate them and dread the bitterness which he has once tasted, even when the years of infancy are left behind. His studies must be made an amusement. He must be questioned and praised and taught to rejoice when he has done well. Sometimes, too, when he refuses instruction, it should be given to some other to excite his envy. At times also he must be engaged in competition, and should be allowed to believe himself successful more often than not, while he should be encouraged to do his best by such rewards as may appeal to his tender years. These instructions may seem but trivialities, in view of the fact that I am professing to describe the education of an orator. But studies, like men, have their infancy, and as the training of the body, which is destined to grow to the fullness of strength, begins while the child is in his cradle and at his mother's breast, so even the man who is destined to rise to the heights of eloquence was once a squalling babe, tried to speak in stammering accents, and was puzzled by the shapes of letters. Nor does the fact that capacity for learning is inadequate prove that it is not necessary to learn anything. No one blames a father because he thinks that such details should on no account be neglected in the case of his own son. Why then should he be criticized who sets down for the benefit of the public what he would be right to put into practice in his own house? There is this further reason why he should not be blamed. Small children are better adapted for taking in small things, and just as the body can only be trained to certain flexions of the limbs while it is young and supple, so the acquisition of strength makes the mind offer greater resistance to the acquisition of most subjects of knowledge. Would Philip of Macedon have wished that his son Alexander should be taught the rudiments of letters by Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of that age? Or would the latter have undertaken the task, if he had not thought that even the earliest instruction is best given by the most perfect teacher, and has real reference to the whole of education? Let us assume, therefore, that Alexander has been confided to our charge, and that the infant placed in our lap deserves no less attention than he, though, for that matter, every man's child deserves equal attention. Would you be ashamed, even in teaching him the alphabet, to point out some brief rules for his education? At any rate, I am not satisfied with the course, which I note is usually adopted, of teaching small children the names and order of the letters before their shapes. Such a practice makes them slow to recognize the letters, since they do not pay attention to their actual shape, preferring to be guided by what they have already learned by rote. It is for this reason that teachers, when they think they have sufficiently familiarized their young pupils with the letters written in their usual order, reverse that order, or rearrange it in every kind of combination, until they learn to know the letters from their appearance, and not from the order in which they occur. It will be best, therefore, for children to begin by learning their appearance and names, just as they do with men. The method, however, to which we have objected in teaching the alphabet, is unobjectionable when applied to syllables. I quite approve, on the other hand, of a practice which has been devised to stimulate children to learn by giving them ivory letters to play with, as I do of anything else that may be days to delight the very young, the sight, handling, and naming of which is a pleasure. As soon as the child has begun to know the shapes of the various letters, it will be no bad thing to have them cut as accurately as possible upon a board, so that the pen may be guided along the grooves. Thus mistakes such as occur with wax tablets will be rendered impossible, for the pen will be confined between the edges of the letters, and will be prevented from going astray. Further, by increasing the frequency and speed with which they follow these fixed outlines, we shall give steadiness to the fingers, and there will be no need to guide the child's hand with our own. The art of writing well and quickly is not unimportant for our purpose, though it is generally disregarded by persons of quality. Writing is of the utmost importance in the study which we have under consideration, and by its means alone can true and deeply rooted proficiency be obtained. But a sluggish pen delays our thoughts, while an unformed and illiterate hand cannot be deciphered, a circumstance which necessitates another wearisome task, namely the dictation of what we have written to a copyist. We shall therefore at all times and in all places, and above all when we are writing private letters to our friends, find a gratification in the thought that we have not neglected even this accomplishment. As regards syllables, no short-cut is possible. They must all be learned, and there is no good in putting off learning the most difficult. This is the general practice, but the sole result is bad spelling. Further, we must beware of placing a blind confidence in a child's memory. It is better to repeat syllables and impress them on the memory, and when he is reading, not to press him to read continuously or with greater speed, unless indeed the clear and obvious sequence of letters can suggest itself without its being necessary for the child to stop to think. The syllables once learned, let him begin to construct words with them and sentences with the words. You will hardly believe how much reading is delayed by undue haste. If the child attempts more than his powers allow, the inevitable result is hesitation, interruption, and repetition, and the mistakes which he makes merely lead him to lose confidence in what he already knows. Reading must, therefore, first be sure, then connected, while it must be kept slow for a considerable time, until practice brings speed unaccompanied by error. For to look to the right, which is regularly taught, and to look ahead, depends not so much on precept as on practice, since it is necessary to keep the eyes on what follows while reading out what precedes, with the resulting difficulty that the attention of the mind must be divided, the eyes and voice being differently engaged. It will be found worth while, when the boy begins to write out words in accordance with the usual practice, to see that he does not waste his labor in writing out common words of everyday occurrence. He can readily learn the explanations or glosses, as the Greeks call them, of the more obscure words by the way, and, while he is still engaged on first rudiments, acquire what would otherwise demand special time to be devoted to it. and as we are still discussing minor details, I would urge that the lines which he is set to copy should not express thoughts of no significance, but convey some sound moral lesson. He will remember such aphorisms even when he is an old man, and the impression made upon his unformed mind will contribute to the formation of his character. He may also be entertained by learning the sayings of famous men, and above all selections from the poets, poetry being more attractive to children. For memory is most necessary to an orator, as I shall point out in its proper place, and there is nothing like practice for strengthening and developing it. And at the tender age of which we are now speaking, when originality is impossible, memory is almost the only faculty which can be developed by the teacher. It will be worth while, by way of improving the child's pronunciation and distinctness of utterance, to make him rattle off a selection of names and lines of studied difficulty. They should be formed of a number of syllables which go ill together, and should be harsh and rugged in sound. The Greeks call them gags. This sounds a trifling matter, but its omission will result in numerous faults of pronunciation, which, unless removed in early years, will become a perverse and incurable habit, and persist through life. End of chapter 1.